This fat little check mark here has become one of the most famous logos in history for one of the most famous sports and clothing brands. You probably can't go a single day without running into some type of Nike product. But you don't need me to tell you that. I'm sure you all own your fair share of Nike gear. Just as Nike is the most famous sportswear brand, I feel like the story of this logo has also become the most famous graphic designer story, or at least the most viral. I see this story on my feed pretty often. It makes the rounds on my social media every couple months, with people gobsmacked at a headline that usually reads something like, Nike only paid $35 for their logo, with people really shocked and confused in the comments. Maybe it's just on my feed, I don't know, but these posts always leave out all of the details and don't tell the full story of the designer Carolyn Davidson, who we'll be discussing on this episode of Culture Creators, where we explore the story of artists and creators that have influenced our culture but who don't get enough spotlight. By the way, admittedly, there is not a whole lot on Carolyn. Her life seems pretty private, so we can't do a deep dive on her life story, but I promise you'll learn a bit more about her and the creator of Nike by the end of this video. So without further ado, let's get cultured. Carolyn Davidson is an American graphic designer, presumably from Oregon. She studied at Portland State University in the late 60s, starting off as a journalism major, but after taking a graphic design course to fill an empty elective, she made the switch to studying graphic design instead. One day in 1969, she was talking to a friend near the stairwell about not being able to afford oil painting supplies for a class she wanted to take. A man approached Carolyn, overhearing her conversation, and asked if she would like to work for his business, Blue Ribbon Sports. He offered Davidson $2 an hour to create charts and graphs for his meetings with his Japanese footwear executives. This man was Phil Knight, a university assistant accounting professor. Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, I would like to take you on the full journey of Blue Ribbon Sports. Like I said, there isn't too much on Carolyn Davidson, but man, let me tell you, I started to research on the history of Nike because, well, it came up in the research of Carolyn Davidson and it was super interesting. So this video kind of turned into the history of Nike kind of. This video was actually like 2 different things before it landed on this, but yeah, time to share with you the detailed research I did on Phil Knight and the creation of Nike. Philip Hampson Knight was born on February 24th, 1938 in Portland, Oregon. His father was a newspaper publisher for the Oregon Journal, which is now defunct. When Phil was young, he wanted a summer job at his father's newspaper, but his father refused, telling Phil that he should look for work on his own. So Phil got a job at the rival paper, the Oregonian, which is still going today and is actually where I sourced a lot of my information from for this video. Phil would work the morning shift, tabulating sports scores. After work, he would run home 7 miles. Which would make sense as he went on to attend the University of Oregon and ran for the track and field team, his best mile being 4 minutes and 10 seconds. That time is insane. I would say he's probably like the fastest billionaire. In college, he was a sports reporter for the student-run Oregon Daily Emerald paper and graduated in 1959 with a business degree. But I've also seen some sources say that it was a journalism degree. I think he studied journalism but ultimately graduated with a business degree. Being on the track team put Phil in contact with coach Bill Bowerman, one of the world's best track coaches, having coached 33 Olympians throughout his career. The two would first meet in 1957. Bowerman was obsessed with improving his runner's shoes after learning how to do so from a shoe cobbler. Knight was apparently the first student to try one of Bowerman's shoes. He fixed up a pair that Knight had, and they worked so well that fellow teammate Otis Davis took them and used them to win gold in the 400-meter dash in the 1960 Olympics. More on Bowerman in a moment. Having run track and field for years made Knight very familiar with shoes. American shoes were cheap, both in price and quality. German shoes, on the other hand, were a lot more expensive and better, but not by much. After graduating from the University of Oregon, Phil went through Stanford's MBA program, where he wrote a paper, Can Japanese Sports Shoes Do to German Shoes What Japanese Cameras Did to German Cameras? In this paper, he theorized that running shoe production should move from Germany to Japan, where the labor was cheaper. You see, at the time, Germany had been dominating the sports shoe space, with German companies such as Puma and Adidas, or Adidas as we like to say in the West. Phil essentially wanted to make higher quality shoes while undercutting the competition. His fellow classmates didn't think his idea had merit, but his professor did. He graduated from Stanford with a master's in business administration in 1962. Then he set out for a trip to Japan to satisfy his idea. He made a stop in Kobe, Japan, where he discovered the Tiger brand running shoes, manufactured by the Onitsuka company. By the way, this company would later become Asics. Impressed with the shoe quality and cost, Phil Knight contacted Onitsuka Kihachiro, the founder of Onitsuka. Phil presented himself as a shoe distributor, and the two set up a meeting together. After showing Onitsuka some of his design concepts, Knight was asked the name of his company, but he obviously wasn't a shoe distributor as he claimed. Knight thought back to his childhood room full of blue ribbons from track, and made up the name Blue Ribbon Sports on the spot. The meeting was a success, and Tiger produced some samples for Knight. After over a year of waiting, around Christmas time of 1963, the first samples came in and he sent 2 pairs to his former coach Barrowman, who loved them so much he bought them and later offered to go into business with Phil to help with product design ideas. Phil gladly accepted, and they both shook hands and agreed on a 50-50 partnership. Phil wrote to Onitsuka later that day, and Blue Ribbon Sports became the sole distributor of Tiger shoes in the western United States. Their fake business became a reality in Eugene, Oregon on January 25th, 1964. By the way, I'm going to be abbreviating Blue Ribbon Sports to just BRS throughout the video. Okay, so who made this initial logo for BRS? Unfortunately, I really don't know. I tried so hard to look for any answers, but I just couldn't find anything. It's possible that maybe Phil Knight or Bill Bowerman created it, as I'm sure they needed a logo fast since they were just starting out. And I didn't find any mention of anyone else being involved with them at the start, so maybe they did make it. I'd be surprised if they did though, because it's a fairly strong logo, and with some simple tweaks I think it can be made into a very good logo. I mean, for one, there's this legibility issue with the overlapping letters, and the spacing between the triple lines of each letter is inconsistent, which bugs me. But that could very well be one of those typography optical balance tricks, but it doesn't seem that way to me. I'm really disappointed that there's no information on this logo. That's the kind of stuff that I like to cover on the channel, to give credit to the artists whose stories might not be well known. But yeah, it's frustrating that that wasn't documented at all, and I don't know why Phil hasn't ever mentioned it or why no one has even asked him. At least not as far as I know. I really couldn't find anything. If you know the answer, then please leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, back to Phil and Bill. I'm skipping over a lot here, but basically after being rejected from several sporting goods stores, they started selling these Tiger shoes at track meets out of the trunk of their Plymouth Valiant. But they were having some issues with their supplier Tiger. They weren't supplying BRS with enough inventory. Tiger would pretty much just send them the leftovers. By the way, there was this one funny tidbit that I read that I definitely wanted to include. I don't know how true this is, but apparently some high school wrestling coach sent a letter to Phil claiming that he was in fact the exclusive distributor of Tiger shoes and asked Phil to stop selling immediately. There's more to that little story, but ultimately, in 1966, Phil went to Japan and convinced Onitsuka to let him be the distributor in the entire United States by lying. Phil claimed that he had an office on the East Coast where Onitsuka wanted to send 5,000 pairs of shoes. Now remember, Phil was only a distributor on the West Coast, in about 13 states I believe. So when he came back to the United States, he rushed to set up an office in Boston where he would send his friend Johnson, his first employee slash salesman. More on him later, trust me, he's important. So that's twice now where Phil lies to climb higher in the industry. I guess there really is merit to the phrase, fake it till you make it. But also, what was Onitsuka doing? If that high school wrestling coach really did have distribution rights, why? Why did Onitsuka give some Joe Schmo distribution rights? And not even just him, Phil as well. Like they don't bother to fact check if Blue Ribbon Sports actually exists. I don't know, I have no idea how Japan conducted business back in the day, but I'm just like dumbfounded at their decision making. Anyway, back to the main story. One day, track runner Kenny Moore was in the middle of a 20-mile run when his right foot began to hurt. Bill Bowerman took a look at his shoe, a Tiger model TG22. Bowerman noticed that there was spongy padding in the heel, but no arch support. Bill was quoted saying, "The outer sole rubber wears away like cornbread. This is not a shit shoe." It's a double shoe. Bowerman got to work on a prototype for a new running shoe that would provide more comfort and durability for distance training and road running. By combining two pieces from existing Tiger shoes, Bowerman constructed a prototype with a cushiony inner sole that ran the entire length of the shoe with shock-absorbing arch support. Sorry, I have to interject here a bit. After a bit more reading, I learned that Bill Bowerman designed the shoe in 1966 under the name TG24, and then in the lead up to the 1968 Mexico Olympics, they changed the name of the shoe simply to Mexico. Not to be confused with the Mexico 66s, which are an entirely different shoe, which by the way are the shoes that Bruce Lee wears in the movie Game of Death. That's a bit debatable though. I think the actual shoes were called the Tai Chis, but they're basically Mexico 66s. The whole history of this shoe is pretty confusing. If anyone has the correct information and would like to correct me in the comments, please do. Anyway, back to the video. After Moore tested the shoes for thousands of miles, and after continuous tweaks, BRS and Onitsuka released the shoe in 1968. They wanted to name the shoe Aztec in honor of the upcoming 1968 Mexico Olympics, but Adidas was already selling a shoe called the Azteca Gold and was threatening legal action. So Bowerman asked, who was that guy who kicked the shit out of the Aztecs? And so the shoe was named after Hernan Cortez, conqueror of the Aztecs. The Tiger Cortez was born. That same year, Knight took a job at Portland State University as an assistant accounting professor, as he was not yet able to make a proper wage from BRS. He would hire one of his accounting students, Penny, for $2 an hour, who would eventually become his wife. In 1969, sales were hitting all-time highs, forcing Knight to hire more and more sales reps, along with graphic designer Carolyn Davidson. This is where the events from the beginning of the video happened. Alright, I've been talking for a long time, and by this point you might be wondering when Nike comes into play. Well, it would also be around this time that BRS would break away from Onitsuka. This is the beginning of the end for Blue Ribbon Sports. So, the Cortez shoe became a dominant seller for BRS and Tiger. In 1969, Phil went on his annual trip to Kobe, Japan to renew his 3-year exclusivity contract that should last until 1972. By the way, this same year, Phil left his accounting professor job to go all in on BRS, paying himself a generous $18,000, just north of $140,000 today. Blue Ribbon was enjoying their partnership, but they realized that they were being limited to distribution, meaning an uncomfortable dependency on a single manufacturer. Onitsuka was also hearing from other American shoe distributors that the potential for US growth was huge, and that they were likely leaving millions on the table by giving BRS exclusive distribution rights, as they were small and inexperienced. Despite their 3-year contract, midway through, an aggressive international sales director by the name of Soji Kitami was hired by Onitsuka. Phil feels uneasy about Kitami, so he pays someone at the Onitsuka export department to be a spy. I thought this was wild, but I read that spying is totally accepted in Japanese business circles, so Phil probably had an easy time getting one. From this spy, he hears word that Onitsuka is planning to cut off BRS. So he invites Kitami to Portland to try and keep the relationship afloat. During Kitami's visit, Phil steals a list from his briefcase and sees that Kitami planned to meet with as many as 18 American shoe distributors, half of which he had meetings already booked with. The relationship became strained, and Kitami proposed a joint venture between Onitsuka Tiger and Blue Ribbon Sports, with Onitsuka holding a 51% share of BRS. Ironically, Tiger was looking to expand to more American distributors, even though they couldn't even supply BRS, their sole distributor, with enough supply. Knight and Bowerman were preparing for a breakup with Onitsuka. They had already designed the Cortez, a highly successful shoe. All they needed now was a new manufacturer. Knight said, "We have them right where we want them. Onitsuka is too slow to react to product development ideas we give them. They never ship what we order, and they'd probably yank the distributorship at the end of the contract in 1972 anyway. What we need is a brand we can control, because we have everything else, the shoes, the top runners. This is the best thing that could ever happen to us." With this knowledge, in an effort to begin planning ahead before Onitsuka cut them off, Phil teamed up with Japanese trading company Niso Owai to locate some new shoe manufacturers. One issue that Phil ran into, however, was that his contract with Onitsuka forbade importing of any other track and field shoes. Phil would get around this by ordering not track and field shoes, but soccer shoes. He came across Canada Footwear Factory, which, in spite of its name, was located in Guadalajara, Mexico. BRS was able to order 3,000 pairs of a soccer shoe called the Mundial 70, or the Mundial 70 since this was made for the 1970 FIFA World Cup held in Mexico. The factory wanted to know the name of their company, but Phil was looking towards the future of his business and was going to produce this soccer shoe under a new brand, but they didn't have anything yet, so they told the manufacturer that they would get back to them. So Phil and his team started to cook up some new branding, which would grace their version of this soccer shoe, as well as a new Waffle runner shoe Bowerman had been working on. I'll save the story of the Waffle shoe at the end of the video in the fun facts section. Now, most of you Nike heads will know the first name Phil was considering for the company, Dimension 6, which was rejected by all his 45 employees for being unspeakably bad. Maybe someone can fill me in on why it's so bad. I personally think it's an okay name. However, the other suggestions by employees were not very good either. They were on a deadline from the manufacturer as well as the US Patent Office, so they needed a name fast. On the morning the name was due, Jeff Johnson submitted one final suggestion that came to him in a dream. The Greek goddess of victory, Nike, had graced Jeff's dreams. Now they were between three names, Dimension 6, which everyone hated, Falcon, and Nike. Knight recalled, Johnson had pointed out that seemingly all iconic brands, Clorox, Kleenex, Xerox, have short names, 2 syllables or less, and they always seem to have a strong sound in the name, a letter like K or X, that sticks in the mind. That all made sense, and that all described Nike. It had all the makings of a great company name, and with the clock running down, with only seconds to spare, Phil reluctantly agreed to Nike, and the rest is history. On May 30th, 1971, the Nike brand was born. Maybe it'll grow on us, Knight recalled being told of the new name. Okay, now finally onto the logo. So, remember that Phil met Carolyn in 1969 while he was still teaching university? Well, after having the name Nike, they also needed a logo for their new shoes. They asked Davidson, who was 21 and fresh out of college, to design a stripe, which is an industry term for a shoe logo. They requested a stripe that had something to do with movement, and that it not look too much like Adidas, Pumas, or Onitsuka Tiger. Now, I'd like to mention something here. In the same vein as social media just focusing on the $35 price tag of the logo and leaving out all the details, I noticed one other thing in my research, and that's that everyone kind of glossed over the relationship that Carolyn had with Phil prior to the logo. Like, I found a lot of sources that were just like, oh yeah, Phil needed a logo, so he went to this university and he hired some design student. And like, that was it. That's all they ever mentioned Carolyn, was that she was a random person that Phil never met before, who he just hired. Sorry, it's just one of those things that bugged me. Anyways, Davidson remembers being in her studio coming up with ideas. She first drew a picture of the shoe, then drew logos on tissue paper to lay over top. She went through a lot of designs, crumpling up and throwing away sketches that looked no good. After about 2 or 3 weeks, she presented about 5 or 6 drawings to Phil Knight, Jeff Johnson, and Bob Woodell, who would later become president for a short time. Carolyn recalls showing them her favorite curvy checkmark design, and there being silence. And then, what else you got? None of the 3 men liked any of the designs, but circled back to the swoosh design as the one that was the least terrible. The swoosh abstractly represents a wing, just how the Greek goddess Nike has. After deciding on a design, Carolyn wanted to refine it, but Woodell said, "We need it in a hurry." So the design got sent to the patent office as is. Phil Knight was famously quoted saying, "Well, I don't love it, but maybe it'll grow on me." Nike would first use the logo on June 18th, 1971. I'm assuming that was for the Mundial 70 shoe. The patent for the logo was filed on January 31st, 1972, and was officially registered on January 22nd, 1974. I'd really love to see Carolyn's original designs, but I think those have been lost to time, unfortunately. Now, this was one part I was surprised to find out. So it's well known the amount Carolyn got paid for her services. Phil paid her for 17 and a half hours of work, about $2 an hour, which ended in a $35 payout, which by the way is like $260 as of 2023. But what I didn't know about the payment is that Carolyn was the one who charged that amount. She said, "I had taken design classes, but I didn't know anything about the business, so I charged $35, which honestly is reasonable. Let me explain why. So this story went viral because of how big Nike is and how low of an amount $35 seems for such a titan of sportswear. But you gotta remember that Nike was still a new company at the time. Sure, BRS had been around for a few years, but they were just distributors of a larger company. Phil only recently started to make a profit himself from his endeavors. Now, I'm not saying that Carolyn got paid well, but I also don't think it was some big swindle by Nike, taking advantage of the little guy. $260 is low, but a fairly okay amount since Carolyn wasn't a professional at the time, and this was her first logo. Once Nike had their name and logo, they were able to wrap up production on their soccer cleat, which they named simply the Nike. By the way, when this shoe released, it didn't do very well in the United States. It did well in Mexico because that shoe was actually made for Mexico's climate. In the United States, when it got cold, the cleat would actually break apart. After the original release of this Nike cleat, Phil and his team switched to another manufacturer in Japan named Nippon Rubber, run by Bridgestone Tires. It was at this new factory where they actually started production on their version of the Tiger Cortez. Once Nike started to sell the Nike branded Cortez in their BRS stores, Kitami learned of this and ended their contract with Onitsuka Tiger on May 1st, 1972. Davidson would continue working for Nike, designing ads, brochures, posters, catalogs, you name it. But there came a point when the company was getting too large for Carolyn to keep up with. So in 1975, her and Knight decided that it was time for a full-service ad agency, and Carolyn left Nike to pursue her freelance work instead. In 1976, the year after Carolyn had left Nike, John Brown and Partners were hired as Nike's first advertising agency. The following year, the ad agency created their first brand ad, "There is no finish line," which showed no Nike products. Now I want to point out this detail in the bottom of this 1977 advertisement. So in my research, I found that Nike changed its logo in 1978, but this poster from September 1977 shows the new logo at the bottom. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here, but I think the new logo made its debut in 77 with this campaign. And speaking of this new logo, there isn't much to say other than they switched the font to Futura, specifically Futura Bold Condensed Oblique. Now, I couldn't find the artist behind the logo update. I almost wanted to give credit to John Brown and Partners, but after a bit more investigation, it doesn't seem like they're the ones who did it. I think they were really just in charge of advertising, nothing to do with logos or things like that. I did find one mention of there being a freelancer working for Nike at this time, so maybe we can give credit to him or her, but for now, the story behind this Futura logo updates is a mystery. This Futura type would be the future for the company, no pun intended. The new logo kept the original Davidson design, but it seems like they cleaned it up a bit and gave it a bit more movement. The new letters also helped ground the logo and give it a lot more confidence. Futura is a timeless font designed by Paul Renner in 1927 and has become pretty synonymous with the Nike brand, but has also been used by many other companies like Domino's, Supreme, Best Buy, FedEx, Red Bull, and so many more. Trust me, this thing's everywhere. The ads by John Brown and Partners really helped Nike explode, and by 1980, Nike had attained 50% market share in the US athletic shoe market. They went public on December 2nd of that year, and that instantly turned Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman into multimillionaires. You'll be happy to know that Carolyn prospered from this and came out on top. While many people today think she got ripped off, she actually got a lot of freelance business from this and became known as the Logo Lady. And even better, in September of 1983, the Nike president at the time, Bob Woodell, suggested to Knight that they should do more for Carolyn, seeing as now him, Phil, and Johnson were very rich. Woodell dialed up Carolyn and said, "Phil and I haven't seen you forever. Why don't you come out and we'll all go to lunch?" When she showed up, there were all these Nike employees present, and they gave her a gold ring in the shape of the swoosh with a diamond in it. And even better, she received a certificate from Knight and an envelope reportedly containing 500 shares of Nike stock. In 1983, at about 17 cents a share, that was about $85 worth of shares. In 2016, Knight himself said that they were worth about $1 million. It's now estimated to be about $4 million, but you can check the math on that, that's just what I read. Also in 2016, in an interview with Carolyn Davidson, she said, "I haven't cashed in a single share of the original stock, but the shares have split a bunch of times and I have sold some of that stock. The stock has split 3 times since I received it, so I can definitely say that I have been well compensated for my design." You must remember too that this was something rather special for Phil to do, because I had originally billed him and he paid that invoice. And yeah, technically she was already compensated for her work, and as far as the world of business goes, she wasn't owed anymore. Bob and Phil really did this out of the kindness of their hearts. I mean, just look at what happened to Mary Grant Prey, the artist of the Harry Potter book franchise, who I covered in my previous video. If you haven't watched that yet, you definitely should. But basically, she received no royalties for her work, just a flat fee, even though the franchise is still using her work to this day. Carolyn says, "When I see my design in everyday life today, it's a little surreal and strange. While I'm proud of what I did, in some way I see it as just another design. It was Phil and the employees at Nike that turned that business into what it was. If they didn't have the savvy, it would have just been another drawing." As of 2002, Davidson was still living in Portland, Oregon. She's married, the mother of 2 grown sons, and a proud grandmother. She retired from graphic design after about 30 years. She was doing volunteer work in her free time. One place she liked to volunteer at was the Ronald McDonald House at Emmanuel Hospital. Since this time, not much else is known as she has kinda stayed out of the spotlight since retiring, but her design and influence will continue to live on. If you like learning about the history of Nike as much as I did, be sure to check out Shoe Dog from Phil Knight, a book that goes over all that we discussed in this video in much more detail. And if you want to dive even deeper, there's a few other books from the early members of Nike, such as Bowerman and the Men of Oregon by Kenny Moore. Alright, on to our fun facts portion of the video. So these facts will be mixed a bit, but will mostly revolve around Nike as I couldn't find too much more on Carolyn Davidson. So, remember that Waffle shoe I mentioned earlier? Well, the design of the shoe came to be one Sunday morning while Bill was having breakfast and watching his wife use the waffle iron. Then an idea struck. What if the same grid pattern in the waffle iron could be used for some extra traction while playing sports? After experimenting pouring rubber in the kitchen appliance, he sewed the outsole to a pair of running shoes and gave it to one of his runners. It was a success. And in 1972, the first original pair of Nike shoes was released, sporting that $35 Nike swoosh designed by Carolyn and being dubbed the Moon Shoe, because the footprints the shoe left resembled those left by astronauts on the moon. But the more accepted name is the Nike Waffle Racing Flat, or anything with waffle in it. Honestly, there's so many variations of the name. Another interesting fact about this shoe is that I think only 12 of these were produced for runners of the 1972 Olympics. And one of these original 1972 Waffle Runner shoes was sold at auction in 2019, and at that time, it became the most expensive sneakers ever sold, fetching over $437,000. Specifically, the pair sold was cobbled by Jeff Hollister, and was the only of the 12 shoes made that was never worn. With that being said, I think it's interesting that there's 3 correct answers for what Nike's first shoe was. If you look it up on Google, this Moon shoe will be the answer. But if you want to get technical, the Cortez was made way before that, even though it was under the Onitsuka brand. But like I mentioned earlier, Nike adopted the Cortez into their arsenal of footwear. And even before the Waffle Runner or the Nike branded Cortez, there was the Nike, that soccer cleat we talked about earlier, which was the first shoe by Nike to bear the swoosh. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think the first Nike shoe was. Alright, I can't end this video without concluding the saga of Nike and Onitsuka Tiger. How everything ended gets kind of spicy. Remember how Onitsuka was thinking of expanding in the US market and then tried buying BRS? Well, in 1973, BRS filed a lawsuit in federal court against Onitsuka. The lawsuit alleged that Onitsuka had breached their contract by soliciting new distributors and demanding that Knight sign over control of BRS for the right to go on distributing Tigers. Also, remember the Cortez? Well, it was being sold by both Nike and Onitsuka. Both companies felt that it was their own shoe to sell. Onitsuka countersued, alleging that Nike was infringing on their trademark by selling the Cortez. By the way, I also heard that Phil was the one claiming that Onitsuka was the one infringing, as BRS had trademarked those shoes in the US. Either way, there was lawsuits left and right. If Nike lost, they'd lose the right to sell the Cortez shoe, as well as other shoes they had trademarked from Onitsuka. By the way, that's one detail that also confuses me. It sounds like they were selling several Onitsuka shoes under the Nike brand, which sounds crazy, but anyway. This lawsuit was a win or die case according to Bill. Ultimately, the judge allowed both companies to sell the shoe, but Nike got to keep the name Cortez, and Onitsuka was forced to change the name to the Tiger Corsair. This would be the only shoe in history to become a bestseller for two different shoe companies. Onitsuka appealed, but later decided on an out-of-court monetary settlement. However, Onitsuka wasn't offering enough money. After several declines from BRS, they settled for an undisclosed amount, but I saw one report say that it was for $400,000, about $2.8 million today. So, Phil and his lawyer Doug show up to claim the money, assuming it would be a simple sign and a transfer of funds into a BRS account. But they get to the office where they were to meet with Onitsuka, and they had this big old trunk with them instead, full of money. Phil's lawyer said it looked like a casket. The Onitsuka lawyer said that this was because of the difficulty of transferring money out of Japan, but he encouraged Phil and his lawyer Doug to sign anyway. But then Doug asked if it was the full $400,000 as promised. Doug recalled, they gulped and said, well, no, it's illegal to bring that much money out of Japan, and we couldn't bring it all. That's all you get. But it's a lot of money and you ought to sign. They knew we were desperate and needed money badly. Knight said, F you, we're out of here. Phil and Doug stormed out into the lobby, and as the elevator door opened, so did the conference room door. The Onitsuka lawyer shouted, don't leave, we got the rest of your money. Turned out that there was a second trunk full of cash, and they said, now sign the papers. But Doug countered, we're not signing anything until a bank has counted the money and we have a certificate of deposit in the company's name. This could be counterfeit for all we know, and you guys have no credibility whatsoever. And so they called the Bank of America, they counted it, got the certificate, and the case was settled. And wow, Onitsuka are just a bunch of scumbags, but what an awesome end to that story. So, while we're giving credit to artists and creators like Carolyn Davidson and John Brown and Partners, let's talk about who created the Just Do It tagline. In 1980, Dan Whedon met David Kennedy while working at an ad agency called McCann Erickson in Portland, Oregon. When that place shut down, the two left to another Portland agency called William Kane, where they worked together on an account of a nearby startup called Nike. The two founded Whedon and Kennedy in 1982 on April Fool's Day, and took Phil Knight and his company along with them. Around this same time, Nike was losing some of its market share, and a young designer working at Nike proposed to Knight that maybe they should do more marketing. Phil Knight was famously misinterpreted saying that he hated marketing, but what he meant is that he actually hated traditional marketing. The agency's first advertisements were 3 television commercials for Nike that were aired during the New York City Marathon in October 1982, which were actually lost up until 2014. And in 1988, the Just Do It slogan was coined and has been associated with Nike ever since. However, what isn't as well known is the inspiration behind the term. According to Dan Whedon, who pitched the slogan to Nike, Dan confessed that he took inspiration from convicted murderer Gary Gilmore's last words. You can read up more on him if you want, but basically he robbed and killed 2 people back to back. He was sentenced to death and chose to be killed by firing squad. Gilmore was strapped into a chair, and behind the screen, 5 men raised their rifles. And Gilmore said, "Let's do it." Interestingly, Gary was executed in 1977 and was the first person to be executed in the United States in almost 10 years, since the Supreme Court ruled out death penalty in 1972. Nike didn't feel like the campaign needed the tagline, but allowed it anyway. Creatives in the agency all questioned if we really needed it, says Whedon now. Nike questioned it. I said, look, I think we do. I believe we have too many disparate commercials that don't add up to anything without a tagline. I'm not married to the thing. We can drop it next round. A lot of shrugged shoulders, but they let it ride. By the way, if you've seen the Nike movie Air that recently came out, you probably knew this fact already, as it's in the beginning of the movie. I watched that movie a few weeks ago and I realized that they kind of stole my thunder on this fact. By the way, while we're on the topic of that movie, I feel like they really sprinkled in like a bunch of random little Nike facts throughout the movie. Like at the end, Carolyn Davidson gets mentioned out of nowhere, which is great. I mean, obviously I like when artists get credit, but it just felt really out of place. And I mean, same with this fact, it kind of just gets dropped in the beginning of the movie. Chris Tucker says it just like unprovoked. And I was gonna cover some of the Air Jordan stuff in the fun facts, but there's a whole movie on it, so I'd say just go watch the movie. But if you want a super fast fun fact about that, I think a pair of Air Jordans is now the most expensive shoe ever sold, replacing the Nike Waffle running shoe. Okay, last fun fact. I'll make this one quick as it's hardly related to Nike. Also, after researching this fact, it's a whole rabbit hole that I think I want to cover in another video. So, Phil Knight's son, Travis Knight, used to be a rapper under the name Chili T, but that didn't work out. So after graduation, Phil got Travis an internship at Will Vinton Studios in Portland, a stop motion studio where Phil was an investor. Now there's so much history here that I'm excited to cover for a future video, but basically, Phil stole the studio from Will Vinton by becoming the majority shareholder. Phil and Travis took over, renaming the company to Leica. They're responsible for some of the best stop motion movies in pop culture, like Coraline, Paranorman, Kubo and the Two Strings, and a few others. Travis Knight acts as president and CEO, with Phil as chairman/owner. And like I said, I will be covering this story more in an upcoming video, so please subscribe if you want to listen to that. It paints Phil in a bit of a different light, despite some of the nice things we went over in this video. But that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider subscribing if you're interested in stories like this. I'm trying to do these about at least once a month, as that's all my current schedule will allow me to do. I could probably post more if I cut down on some of the research, but that really goes against what I'm trying to do here, where I collect all of the details and give you a complete story. Right, because it's easy to just Google these things and get a summary, but what's difficult is getting the whole picture, which is what I like covering. And that takes time, as so many resources just have conflicting information. That's been the biggest roadblock for me, honestly. And who knows, maybe some of the information in my video is incorrect. And if it is, please correct me in the comments. I would love for this to be a place where we can preserve the legacy of this artist. Alright guys, see you next time, and don't forget to keep learning and stay cultured.